All right. So a very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar on independent living donor advocacy. I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Ms. Jaya Jairam. It's also her birthday today. Sorry for bringing you in here on your birthday, Jaya. You can blame it on Brendan. He was not available on a Saturday. This webinar is brought to you jointly by NATCO, which is the Network and Alliance of Transplant Coordinators, and the Mohan Foundation. The aim of this session really is to provide all of us a comprehensive understanding of the importance of advocating for living donors, discuss that whole thing in the unique challenges faced by the living donors in India, in the unique context of India, and the steps we can take to improve support and the outcome for donors. As we all know that India has a substantial big living transplant program at this time. Can you please allow me to share screen? Just 3 slides, I don't have anything else. So these are our figures over the last 12 years. We have a very strong and big living transplant program. As you can see, in the last 12 years, we did almost 79,000 living kidney donors and 17,265 living liver donors. Out of this, 86% kidney transplants were through living donors and 81% were through living liver donors. And I would also like to add here at this point that 80% of all living donors are women in India. These are the figures for 2023. 14,000 over 14,000 transplants from living donors, which make almost 83% of transplants that are conducted in the country last year. A small 17% were cadaveric transplants. The rest were all. And given the huge need and given the whole supply and need and availability gap, this program is of course likely to continue. It's only going to grow bigger in the coming years, as is also evident in the meteoric rise in the number of transplant centers that have come again. As against 200 kidney transplant centers in 2010, we have now 568 living transplant centers for kidney, and as against 30 centers providing liver transplant in 2010, we now have 234 centers doing living living liver transplants. So it's important that we know advocacy for living donors becomes important at so many fronts, which Brendan will bring to us. Right from providing emotional and psychological and financial support to donors, ensuring that they are protected by the laws and the ethical guidelines that safeguard their health and rights, and ensuring that they receive long-term medical follow-up to monitor their health post-donation. And I'm hoping that by the end of this webinar and the panel discussion, participants would have a deeper understanding of living donor advocacy in India and be equipped with knowledge and strategies to support this vital cause. Hopefully together we can work towards a more supportive and efficient system that benefits donors, of course also the recipients, ultimately saving more lives and improving quality of life for all involved. The format for today is we have a very dynamic speaker. Both Jia and I've had the opportunity to hear him in separate forums. She heard him at ISODP. I had the privilege of being with him at a TTS webinar, and we were both determined to bring him to India and let our coordinators hear him. I'll take a moment to introduce Brendan. After he has spoken, Jaya would introduce the panelists, but we will begin with Brendan. Brendan Parent is the Director of Transplant Ethics and Policy Research and Assistant Professor in the Division of Medical Ethics with joint appointment in surgery at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He is Principal Investigator on Government and Foundation Grants, studying ethics and regulation of transplant research. Parent serves as an independent living donor advocate, is an advisory member for the National Kidney Foundation, and a member of the National Donation Leadership Council for the Alliance. He provides ethics consultation for transplant and medical research programs across the United States. His current work also focuses on ethics challenges surrounding determination of death by neurological criteria, research on the deceased, and big data and artificial intelligence in health research. He has published academic articles in peer-reviewed journals spanning law, medicine, science, sports, and ethics. And his work has been featured in the Washington Post, the NY Times, Chicago Tribune, and the like. Over to you, Brendan. Help us understand what is independent living donor advocacy, what was the genesis of this concept, how are you looking at it in the USA, and what is it that we can learn from what's happening in the US. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pallavi. It is such a pleasure to be here. And next time I'm coming all the way to India. You cannot hear me. Testing 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me now?
We can hear. Yeah, of course, we can hear him, Pallavi.
Okay. Pallavi, can you hear me? Testing. Yeah. Okay.
Pallavi, can you
I'm going
hear?
to. Ah.
Could hear you
Okay.
earlier,
but as long I'm taking Jaya's word for it for now.
You're choosing to.
Okay.
Ganesh, are you able to hear Brendan? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Some
Yes,
other
ma'am,
hands
loud and
For
nodding.
clear.
everyone else.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
Pallavi, there's some issue at your end.
All right. Well, I'll thank her, and then you can pass my thanks on when she can hear you later. And next time I'm coming all the way to India to speak with you. It's a pleasure, and I've worked with Pallavi in other contexts through the Transplantation Society, so it's my pleasure to come and talk about this. And of all the work that I do, and most of the work I do is in research at this point. I love the ILDA work because it gives me an opportunity to be face to face with patients and seeing the ethical considerations that I work through on a daily basis play out in real time, and how the theoretical doesn't always apply to the practical and vice versa, right? So how to bridge that gap is, I think, truly, truly important. So I'm going to share my screen for a few slides here, and I'm going to try not to take too much time because I really look forward to the discussion. And I have to put a little caveat here. Well, first, here are my disclosures, and none of these are particularly relevant to the ILDA context. One I don't have on here is what I'm going to discuss today is clearly from the US context. And so I want to acknowledge that perhaps some of what I talk about might not be relevant in India or vice versa. And so I would be very grateful for an education in that regard. Okay. So I will start with sort of pointing out that in the United States, the independent living donor advocate is a federally required role as per the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid and the Organ Procurement Transplant Network. And so there are specific legal requirements. So this is just a way of saying it's important to know what the policy is, right? Whether it is a legal requirement, a regulation, or an institutional requirement to know what your job is. So that's what I'll tell you as a lawyer, right? And I am a lawyer. But I might also be the first lawyer to tell you that I don't really care what the law says. What I care about is doing the right thing to promote the rights, well-being, and best interests of people. And in this case, as a living donor advocate, I believe the job is to advocate exclusively for the rights, well-being, and best interests of the potential donor. So what does advocacy mean in this context? Well, it can mean different things. Sometimes it means helping to make the case for the patient who wants to donate, right? To be a bulldog for them and what they believe will enable their autonomy to do what they want to do to realize their values, right? But sometimes it can also mean protecting these patients from themselves and from others, right? So this is clearly the sort of eternal balance between enabling autonomy and acting paternalistically, right? To provide tough love to protect the individual because maybe you have more information and know what's best. So this is a way of saying that we need to consider the rights, well-being, and interests holistically of each individual donor. So the other bold term, what does exclusively mean? Well, it means to advocate for these individuals without concern for the recipient, the hospital, or other potential stakeholders, right? There are other people who represent those interests, and your job, the lone person in the trench, right, is to be that guardian for that patient who could be a donor. And so I'm just going to give you a couple case studies. The first one is, and I'm going to say, I'm not going to try to solve these or provide answers, but I just want to paint a picture that demonstrates this tension. So first study, the 22-year-old female has a history of not having a home, is not currently employed, has one child, and no other close relations. This individual comes to the donor clinic wanting to donate to someone she calls a good friend. And you find out that she met this person through social media, let's say Facebook 3 years ago, and she doesn't give you more information voluntarily. And after prodding for a while, you get some conflicting information about how close they actually are. And then finally learn that really they just met in person, the donor and the potential recipient, for the first time a few weeks ago. You then find out that the patient and her child are currently living with this potential recipient, who is letting the patient use a brand new car whenever she wants. And you can't deny that this patient has full capacity and understands the risks of donation. So what do? Do you let this person donate or not? And obviously you have to investigate more fully, but I think it's important for the ILDA to push on their intuitions, right? I think on paper here, we see some very clear risks of coercion, right? Of undue influence in the form of shelter, in the form of access to transportation, potentially food, right? Safety for her child, and say, wait a minute, this is going to make it impossible for her to fully weigh the risks and benefits of donating a kidney. But to push on that intuition, we can also say, hey, you know what? It's not impossible that she has a perfectly pure motivation to donate to this person that she genuinely has a close connection with. And she now has a situation that's far better than she would have had without this connection to this person. And it is possible that these benefits are not attached to the donation. So it's just a way of saying we have to push on our intuitions, dig and get as much information as possible to truly balance autonomy and paternalism. The second case I want to point out is a case of potential liver transplant. We have a 47-year-old man in end-stage liver failure who is single and a father of a 27-year-old son with severe intellectual disability. And it has been determined that this child can think on level with someone who's about 4 years old, okay? The father wants to consent on behalf of his own son to donate a piece of his son's liver to himself. And his argument is that, well, I am my son's sole caretaker. There is no one else available. And his son's well-being depends on his own well-being. If the father were to die, who knows what would happen to this child? Now, when speaking to the son, we learn that really he only understands that he's here to help dad, but he doesn't really know what that means. So what do you do in this case, right? What is in the true best interests of this young man? And we might feel that he really doesn't understand what's going on here, right? That it would be too challenging and maybe a violation of his, maybe he doesn't even have autonomy, right? As someone without the capacity to truly appreciate the risks and benefits here. At the same time, let's think about the long-term consequences if dad dies. So this is just to point out some really challenging cases where the job of the ILDA is to be a true investigator, a true compassionate advocate, and to think holistically. Okay, so I'm not going to solve these for you. We can talk more about them if they're relevant enough. But I will say it's important to think about who the right kind of person is to be the ILDA, right? And both according to the laws in the United States, and what I think is important is that this individual has to be unaffiliated with the transplant program, right? They need to be independent so that their paycheck is not dependent on subscribing to the views of the institution, or that they don't feel beholden to the institution. But they also have to know about living donation and about transplant, or at least willing to learn. And this also has to be a person who has good bedside manner, right? Knows how to engage with patients. You could be the most, have the strongest moral compass and be the best thinker in the world. But if patients don't want to open up to you, you're not going to be able to do your job, right? You have to deal with challenging patients, be alert to nonverbal cues. I can't tell you how many times, I'm speaking with a patient and I'm getting some words, but the body is telling me something very different, right? And so you use those nonverbal cues to investigate particular lines of inquiry in particular ways. And then part-time, right? So is ILDA a full-time job? I wish it was, and it should be. And some institutions it is, but if you don't have the finances, then you have to have the time outside your regular job. So this is a unique combination of circumstances. And I'll say it's important to take your time to find the right person. NYU has two. One, my colleague has a long history of social work career, who worked in transplant for a while, and then he went into teaching. So he's being an adjunct teacher at some institutions while doing this. And the other is me, right? I'm a medical ethicist with a focus on transplant. And then training. I will say that there are a number of resources that are available through the American Society of Transplantation and a number of other organizations that can basically provide the skill sets, help you work through case studies, and then give you sort of a certification to become an ILDA. And I'd be happy to provide those resources later. And for that individual, whoever you do end up hiring, you have to understand the particular relationships and specifications of the program. So for example, we have the National Kidney Registry, which matches potential donors with potential recipients in the event that a donor is not a direct match for the person they want to donate to. You have to know how that program works and how to talk about it. I have some potential donors who come forward and say, well, of course I want to donate to my father, but I don't want to donate to some stranger, right? So that just doesn't work for me. You have to explain why that would be important or beneficial for your father, or vice versa. Some say, actually, even though I could donate directly to dad, I want to go through the registry. Another interesting point, in the United States, each donor also has to meet with a social worker. And there are interestingly complementary but distinct roles between the living donor advocate and the social worker. The fact that they both sort of need to look out for the psychosocial and emotional well-being of the donor is important. But there might be some distinction in how the patient talks to each person, right? It's possible that the patient might be more willing to open up with someone who is not technically a clinician, someone who, again, identifies as an advocate and says, look, I have no skin in the game. Whether you donate or not doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that this is the right thing for you to do. Just being able to say that makes a big difference in how a patient might talk to you. And again, the ILDA is supposed to be looking for a bag of cash that's being handed under the table, or again, providing too many sort of resources to the potential donor, or maybe saying, hey, look, if you don't do this, I'm going to kick you out of the house, right? The ILDA might still also pick up on other things that the social work is supposed to do, or other members of the donor team, like issue of capacity. Does this patient truly understand what they're getting into? So there has to be good communication between the two, a true partnership. And then the timing and regularity, right? So according to the regulations in the US, the ILDA is supposed to be the first contact for the patient, the very first person they speak to after their intake form. And in my opinion, this is a new change, and it's not super helpful, because the ILDA is supposed to help the patient think through whether donation is the right thing for them to do. And in order to do that effectively, the patient has to have information about what donation is. And I think that information comes from the nephrologist or the hepatologist, the infectious disease doctor, the surgeon. And until they have that, that collection of data, the ILDA has a tougher job providing sort of the clinical picture. But regardless, this is the regulation, so we talk first. I prefer on evaluation day, when I'm speaking to a patient, to be a blank slate. I don't want the nephrologist telling me, oh, we've got this patient coming in who has this history of alcohol use and, you know, has a strange relationship. You know, I like to develop my own understanding of what brings the donor in for potential donation. And I don't want others to influence that, right? To bias my perspective. And it's very important that additional meetings are available, right? So even though I have to be the first point of contact, I always want to speak to the donor again after they've met with other members of the team. And then again, going forward regularly, right? As they continue to think about donations through and until the day of surgery. And then we speak with them again after surgery to follow up, to find out how their experience was, how they're feeling, how the care was in the hospital, right? Make sure that they understand their follow-up schedule and continue to follow up to make sure that they go to their appointments, have medications they need, are getting the care that they deserve. So this is not a one and done deal. And the last sort of set of points I'll make here is that the ILDA needs to have a voice at the donor committee meetings. And in that case, it means kind of the power to veto, right? The same as the nephrologist, same as a social worker. And make sure that they know that they're not alone, that this is a collaborative process, because ultimately the ILDA wants the same thing as the rest of the committee. And that is to make it possible for clinically and psychosocially suitable candidates to donate, right? You have the same goal. And so if the ILDA says, look, I don't think this candidate will be successful as a donor, then it's important to listen to that, because it will reflect not just in that particular case, right, but could have reverberation effects if a donor donates who probably shouldn't have. For the program, it could be a problem. For the institution, for trust in transplant and trust in medicine. And give the ILDA the power to speak up if they see or wonder about something that might even be outside their purview. So for example, things like a history of smoking or drinking, if they see this, say, hey, you know what, docs, is it okay that this patient drinks, 8 beers a night, 4 days a week? And the team might then say, oh, we didn't hear that. The patient didn't tell us that, right? So they become part of the team. And give this individual a non-affiliated lifeline, right? It's hard to be sort of the sole warrior in a process that might seem or feel adversarial when it should be collaborative. It's great if there can be two ILDAs, but I'm sure that can be a lot to ask for a number of programs. But give them the opportunity to develop lifelines to other individuals or institutions. If there's an ethics committee or a medical ethics consultant, or if not, at least someone who is unaffiliated with the hospital, who has maybe a good moral intuition and can help them think through patient-institution dynamics. So I'll stop there and pass it back over to Jaya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brendan. That was very, very, very insightful. We've had a couple of sessions on ILDA, but this gave us the complete picture. So we keep thinking about, is this going to be an adverse? Is it going to be looked at as someone who is out to put the spanner in the works? And how do we make this work? So glad you brought that up. Pallavi, are you audible?
I'm not sure. Am I?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Will you introduce, thank you, Brendan. Will you introduce the panelists, Satya?
Yeah, all right. So we now move over to the panel discussion, and we have a wonderful lineup of panelists who have joined us today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Sudha Bhamiripati. Sudha co-founded and heads an AI-based organization. But the more relevant thing is that her husband underwent a cadaveric liver transplant, doing extremely well. And Sudha is here to share her experiences with us. Welcome, Sudha. We also have Dr. Gurvinder Kaur. Yeah, we also have Dr. Gurvinder Kaur, who is the facility director at Fortis Hospital, Basant Kunj, New Delhi. Welcome, Dr. Gurvinder. Is Dr. Gurvinder here?
Yeah, ma'am, you can unmute yourself.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
All right.
Yeah.
We have Shiju. He is Shiju Nair. He is one of the senior transplant coordinators in Mumbai. Works at Apollo Hospital, Navi Mumbai. Shiju. Welcome, Shiju.
Yeah, thank you.
We have Tripti Nanda here, who is the JCI coordinator and a consultant. JCI stands for Joint Commission International, and they're an international accreditation body for hospitals. Ms. Nanda has a vast experience in quality for healthcare organizations. Welcome, Tripti Nanda.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction.
Hi, Tripti.
Yeah. Do we have Dr. Yadav here, Dr. Avdesh Yadav? He is the Chief Medical Officer at NATO, that is the National Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization, that's under the aegis of DGHS, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, New Delhi. I'm not
He
sure
said
if
he
he's
would be a
here.
little late, but he will join eventually.
All right, fantastic. Lastly, we have Dr. Atul Kochar, who's the Chief Executive Officer at NABH. NABH stands for National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Healthcare Providers in India. Welcome to this panel, Dr. Kochar.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
Pleasure
you
to be
for being here, Dr. Kochar. Thank you so much.
All right, so my first question is to Sudha. I'd like to bring Sudha in here. Sudha, can you please unmute? Are you?
I am
there?
unmuted.
Okay, all right. As a caregiver to your husband who underwent a liver transplant, I want you to share your experiences. You've shared it before with in a different forum, but we decided that your experiences would really add value to this panel. You were considering to be a donor at one point in time. Could you please share with us what challenges and emotions did you face during the entire process?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jay. I think it was great hearing Brendan. Thank you, Brendan, for your wonderful talk. My husband was diagnosed with non-alcoholic cirrhosis of the liver, and we decided that the family will not donate, and if it comes to it, we'll register for a cadaveric transplant. But he deteriorated rapidly, and watching it was hard, and we have the same blood group. And I was told, I said, I should give. And I think that's the point at which you somewhat lose control of the whole process, because the patient is not well, naturally. Everyone is focused on the patient or the potential recipient. And you're sort of swept away in this thing because, you do want to do good, but you are also frightened. You're frightened, you're confused. My family did not want me to go through it, my immediate family. My husband's sister wanted me to go through it. You could see the different sort of pulls and pushes. And at one point, I felt, there is a point at which you want to step out and say, I don't know, I'm not sure about this. Because the process of getting to a yes, you are physically a candidate takes time. It takes 6 weeks, and there are gates. So you go through the first gate, and as you keep crossing the gates, actually your anxiety increases. The patient may be doing better because you're likely to be a donor. It was disconcerting. And I'm highly educated. I work, I run my own company. I have a voice, I have agency. It's not as if anyone was forcing me to do it. But the caregivers belong to the patient, the recipient. They're playing on his sort of side of the court. And they don't explain everything to you. I think I would have liked it, and I've mentioned this to Jaya before, that if someone walked me through to that point of acceptance, I don't think I ever got there. We were very fortunate. We got a cadaveric liver, and I did not have to go through it. But I was 2 weeks away from it. And I was mentally gearing up for it with a lot of resistance from my children and a lot of, it's confusing. It's very, very confusing. And there is no money involved here. So this is a husband. We both, share all our bank accounts. So it's not as if there was anything else at play. But I'll tell you, all of us heaved a sigh of relief that I did not have to go through it, including me. And I would not judge someone who went some distance and said, you know what, I'm too frightened to do it. I'm going to hand it back to you, Jaya. I do have some more stuff to say, but I just thought I'll introduce the gray that you work in when you're in that space.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your, it's one of the most difficult things for a family to go through. There is no envy here for each and every family that goes through this dilemma, this confusion. Thank you so much for sharing.
I'd like
Pallavi?
thank you, Jaya. Thank you, Sudha, for that sharing. It takes courage to bring in that kind of honest sharing. And I would like to bring in Dr. Kaur at this point of time. Dr. Kaur, you are the facility head for a big transplant center, a chain of hospitals that are strongly focused on transplants. And given the fact that we have a significantly high number of living donations in our country, and also given the fact that there is a huge focus on recipient care, the whole system is kind of geared to make that transplant happen.
Yeah.
How do you then address this kind of an issue? And Sudha very categorically mentioned she had a voice, she had an agency, she's economically independent. We know that we're constantly the kind of patriarchal society that we have women that do not have what Sudha had. How do you, as a senior person, what would
Yeah. First of all, Sudha so beautifully put it. I mean, nobody could have explained it better. And, could have put in words the emotion that she went through. Yes, when you promote an organ transplant program, and that to a living donor program, uh, the donor is the one who needs a lot of attention, but unfortunately does not get that kind of attention. So clearly, two different aspects to it. One, before you sit into a committee which is asking you, are you ready for a donation? Are you doing it out of your own? Are you doing it voluntarily and all of that? While there is that kind of forensic that happens, that kind of investigation that happens, but that's a point which is too far off the line. There are too many gates to close before that. So, as someone senior in the organization, you set the tone for how your organization functions. And that's where, when you talk to transplant coordinators, when you hire them, when you engage with them, when during your daily rounds, you talk to them and ask them what's happening, are you working on a case? What's the case? The first thing that you ask them is, have you met the donor? Is the donor comfortable? And the first thing that I firmly believe is, before you put a donor to testing, the very fact that you've made a donor evaluate for a fitness to undergo testing, the first thing that has to happen is psychological assessment of a donor. Understanding, is the donor prepared? Is the donor actually willing? And only then you subject the donor to clinical assessment and testing. So that's the first thing that that's a very softer angle to it. That's the first thing that you end up doing. When a patient walks into a transplant coordinator's office asking for, I've been suggested a transplant and these are the documents, I've been asked to learn from you what is the process, and there's a donor and the recipient who walked in together, and there's more of family, the first thing as a transplant coordinator you do is you assess how confident is the donor in this conversation. Is the donor being brought along, or is the donor having an independent voice? As Sudha said, I had my own independent voice. So that's the first finer nuance that you pick up. And then you slowly align a living donor advocate who engages in a conversation, tries to understand where is this thought of donating coming from. And that's where, when you build up that confidence and you know that this person is prepared, this person knows what's going to happen, is completely out of one's own understanding willing to donate, do you let the rest of the process start? So that's a very subtle angle to it, but that's where you start. And as Brendan was saying, that let donor advocates also be part of committees. Yes, that's where you may be a silent spectator, but because of your association of talking to the donor, you give the donor that confidence that I'm not alone in this room. There's somebody who will speak for me. There will somebody who will, give voice to my fears. And that's how it's important for a living donor advocate to be in that committee room where those questions are being asked, where that willingness to donate is been kind of being checked, investigated, and then approved upon. So that's what I think, as leaders, we are required to do. We're required to set the tone, and we're required to give a direction to our people. It's not the number of transplants, but it's the kind of transplants that you do. And also, after having donated, probably the living donor advocate should be with the donor, actively engage with the donor for at least for the first 6 months, because we forget the donor after the donor has donated. So that's where we need to set our people, and
Dr.
that's the
Kaur,
direction that we need to give.
if I may
Yeah.
ask, who is the independent living donor advocate in your hospital? Who's playing
Yeah.
that role?
Yeah. So, in our hospital, because when you go by statistics, you look at it's more often the female who donates rather than the male, and therefore it's easy for them to connect with a fellow female. So in our hospital, I had my deputy medical superintendent who's understanding the process, who's good at her communication, who's also a certain age to be taken seriously. A person would also need to come with a certain age maturity to be taken seriously. So in my hospital, I have my deputy medical superintendent who is the living donor advocate. Yeah.
Jaya, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. All right. Moving over to Shiju. Shiju, we know that Apollo Hospital is JCI accredited. Can you share with us as to who fulfills the ILDA role in your hospital, and what is the donor care process, in your hospital setup?
Yeah, thanks to be part of the panelist interview, first of all. And I'm supporting the statement of government also, because 90% which were seen to be the female donor. Whenever the female donor, always they are open to be a female, the person to be that moreover than the male person to be communicated. So in our Apollo hospital in Mumbai, we have the doctor who is a female, that's a working as a general physician, is not a part of any committee, any kind of the transplant program or something like that. She's an independent person, and she's taking care of the as a donor advocate. And because both side as a social, psychological, as well as the medical part of view to be that she can be understood, and accordingly we the management and they appointed her as a donor advocate. And in the process, obviously, first of all, the psychological assessment of the donor will be do in initial stage. Then the person will direct to the donor advocate. So that's the current practice what we are doing in our hospital. And once the clearance from the both side, as well the psychologist, psychiatrist, then as well as the donor advocate, then only we'll take into move forward as a potential donor for the recipient.
Thanks,
I
Siju.
also wanted to ask you, Shiju, um, have there been any cases where the donor advocate has rejected any donor?
Yes, we do have the cases that she directly communicate to the physicians to be that she's forced to be taken into as a donor, and this going to be from my side. I am not going to be give the clearance for a donation, but that is the inter communication to the transplant team, because that should not be a problem in the donor family. Is the case of wife to husband. That should not be a problem to the wife to stay on the rest of the life with the husband. So she, as I told you, that's a background of the doctor. Also, she denied the doctor on the background of as a clinical manner. That's because of this reason she might be a not be considered as a potential donor. That to be safeguard her future things to be. So then they
Makes sense.
cancel the case, and then gone for the within the family, brother to brother, like that they consider the case.
Okay. Pallavi, you were thinking.
I'd like to bring in Tripti at this point. So Tripti, you've had a lot of experience, as a JCI consultant, and you heard both Dr. Kaur and Siju, both representing hospitals that are JCI accredited and have certain systems in place to look at an independent living donor. Is this how JCI really visualizes the ILDA role? And I mean, do you believe that someone from within the hospital can truly remain unbiased and to this whole process and solely advocate for donor care, especially in the context of hospitals in India, especially in the context of private hospitals in India. So if you could just comment on that, Tripti.
Yes, thank you for asking me this question. The Joint Commission International has brought this standard, particular standard, which is enlisted the criteria under COP 9, 9.1, and 9.2. Why I am mentioning these three things, that COP 9, 9.1, and 9.2, just to bring in front of the participant that how importance the Joint Commission International gives to the living donor program. So these particular standards define the criteria of independent living donor advocate. It's not that everybody could be independent living donor advocate. There are 7 criteria which is specified by the Joint Commission. The first and foremost criteria, I think, as Siju and Gayatri, Gurbinder Kaur ma'am already spoken about it, that persons should be very, very sound in knowledge, where they have a fair idea about transplant process. They should have fair idea about organ donation process, medical ethics, informed consent process. The second, point which JCI expect the ILDA must be focusing on the donor's right only. They cannot see anything and everything. Only the donor's right should be protected. The third important criteria which JCI talks about ILDA, that if the person must be independent of the transplant team. So again, I repeat, that must be independent of the transplant team. I'll talk little more about it as I move forward. The fourth criteria, it talks about that person who is in independent live donor advocate going to be appointed as an ILDA must be autonomous and in his or her decision making abilities. And the fifth criteria is going to be that the person who is who is serving as an ILDA must ensure that the cultural respect is given to the each and every donor. The sixth, which is a deviation, I would not say, but which we do it in the context of India, we do employ them by the hospital. So here JCI brings this standard requirement that it talks that the person, if you employ from who is situated within the hospital, need to ensure that the person is not reporting to any member of the transplant team. The seventh criteria talks about that the person is not involved in the routine transplant activities. Now, having said these 7 criteria, I think it talks about that it's a challenge in the context of India. Appointing someone from the outside, it's a cost. Definitely, we are a developing country. JCI is not a prescriptive. It gives the criteria as an organization. If we can fulfill the criteria, we can have somebody from within the hospital also. But it is a challenging job to prove each and every measurable element which is enlisted, just I spoke about under the 7 criteria. So now, how do we remain unbiased? As you asked me the question that if somebody is from within the hospital, how do we prove that we are unbiased, that ILDA is unbiased? So here it comes now about we need to talk more and more about the institution. We have to talk about governing and leadership role. So the institution must, yes. Hello?
Carry on. Nobody said anything. Carry on.
Okay. So, it requires robust institutional support and very ethically sound governing and leadership body who would, talk, who would only keep the donors' well-being at at their own interest. So, I generally prefer the word called TEA, having T, like you have to, the institution or the governing leadership body has to give that much of time to the ILDA every day basis, as they're having tea time every day for approximate 30 minutes to understand how it is going to protect them, to support them, to understand that nothing is going wrong, and ensuring that every single activity which is independent live donor advocate is doing, it is completely unbiased. So when I say that TEA, the T stands for transparency. So the independent living donor advocate need to ensure that they are transparent. So institution the governing body must be involved in defining the policy protocol, which is very, very clear, very, transparent in nature. Not only that, handing over the job description to the independent life donor advocate, which is very precisely written, what is expected, how it is to be implemented, and also the affiliations and relationship with the different, team members of the hospital. Having said that, also it is very important to define that in case of conflict of interest, how this ILDA, how this person who being advocate, whom to approach, how to resolve the issues. This kind of transparency is required from the governing and leadership body. And then coming to the ethical standard, which is E, that which talks about that having a very high ethical standards where the institutional interest or financial interest should not come in the picture at all. It should be the donor's interest where the institute or the governing and leadership role must focus on. And A stands for accountability. The person whom you are appointing from within the hospital and you want them to be unbiased, you need to support them. You can expect the accountability, but you need to support them in terms of, giving them appropriate training, comprehensible education, which is available to ensure that they have up-to-date knowledge to support the donor for protecting them, promoting them, and advocating them. So we can remain unbiased if you are taking somebody from within the hospital, but it is an institutional, a lot of vigilance is required from the institution as well as governing body. So it is challenging. So I mean, we completely understanding the fact that we are a developing country. We may not have that much of financial stability to hire somebody from the outside, but definitely in the coming era, this is the solution which is going to be, because living donor is the solution to bridge the gap between the requirement of the organs and availability of the organs. I hope I have
Thank you
answered
so
your
much.
question. Yeah.
Yes, that was very comprehensive. We'll come back to you in a bit, Tripti. I
Sure.
would bring in Brendan at this point in time. So as Dr. Nagral has also said, no hospital employees can really be autonomous. He's put it up in the chat. So I want to ask you as to what is the general process in the transplant centers in the US? What are the drawbacks of having someone from within the hospital manage this aspect? Is it all external, or can it be handled by someone internal as well, or will they invariably face the pressure?
This is a really tough issue, right? And I'll tell you, what does the requirement say? The requirement says you can't have anything to do with the institution, and you also have to know everything about living donation, right? And so, and you have to be able to, be paid for your services, right? So, so how are you going to create the time? How do you have the knowledge base and also be completely separate? So this is what the theory is, but what actually happens in practice is going to be very different at different institutions. And I'll put my cards on the table and explain the situation. I am part of the NYU medical system, right? I'm in the Department of Population Health, which sits in the School of Medicine, which is adjacent to the Department of Surgery, right? I have a joint appointment in the Department of Surgery. The Transplant Institute also sits in the Department of Surgery, but I'm not in the Transplant Institute. So am I too conflicted, right? Because, and also, my money all comes from grants. I scrape and get all of my own money to support my own salary. So none of it comes from the Transplant Institute. Am I too conflicted, right? The fact that I'm sort of a member of the same institution. So I make this declaration. I don't feel as though I cannot advocate exclusively and effectively for my patients, but it's possible that some might feel that way. So how do I reconcile this? Well, I make it very clear when I meet each potential donor what my role is and my relationship is to the Institute, and give them an opportunity to say whether they feel comfortable with that or not, right? It's not perfect, because how often are they going to say, no, I want somebody who's less conflicted, right? They usually say, okay. But I will tell you that there are other institutions that actually, have their ILDAs under sort of the Transplant Institute banner, but they use sort of a different pool of money to sort of justify the hiring. So you got to do what you can with what you have available. I think more important is that you find the right person who really understands the job, who has the confidence to use their own voice to advocate for people who are in disadvantaged or hierarchical power relationships.
Chad, I think I'd like to, I wish Dr. Abdesh was here. I think is.
Pallavi, you're not audible at all.
I don't know what's happening to my sound system. Carry on, Jaya. Carry on.
I can hear you, Pallavi.
Carry on, Jaya.
Okay. All right. So, do we have Dr. Avdesh here? I don't think so, right? Okay. So let me bring in Dr. Kochhar at this point in time. Dr. Kochhar, are you there?
Yeah,
I don't think Dr.
please,
Yadav is here. Dr. Kochhar is there.
Okay. So Dr. Kochhar, the law mandates that the authorization committees, for approving the living related cases, these authorization committees must include NGO representatives, must have women representation. So how effectively do you think these committees play the role of ILDA, especially since they interview the donor and the family at the fag end of the process? What is your view on that? And also, should NABH mandate the ILDA role? Today, I understand it just mentions that the safeguarding informed consent must be facilitated, but it doesn't go into the depths of whether an ILDA role must be specified like JCI does. So your views on that?
Can you hear me, Jaya?
Yes.
Dr. Kochhar, if I may add to Jaya, I've been briefly part of the Hospital Authorization Committee. And so as an NGO representative, as an outside person, but somehow everything works so it's so driven to make sure that it's within the legality of the system, that there's that the donor qualifies within the legal requirements of the country, and other aspects just seem to go into the background. The whole process is so driven to make sure that is met. Autonomy and all, somehow, even with someone like me sitting there, I find it difficult to bring that whole process. If you could just comment on that as well, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Jaya. Thank you, Pallavi. I think at the outset, I must congratulate you for organizing this webinar. It's personally speaking a day of learning for me. It's been a very good discussion. Thank you, Brendan, and all the other panelists who have contributed, all the experiences. So essentially speaking, the very idea of SOP is the very idea of SOPs, the very idea of quality or the standards is very nascent to our country, right? While JCI has been certainly around for 72 plus years, we are only 18 years young, right? However, I think because of all the learnings which have been happening, we today are partnering with about 22,000 hospitals. And we are adding, at least 250 new hospitals on the path of quality, standardizations, SOP. When passionate people representing groups like you come together, I think and make a very strong case for something, then over the time, it becomes first established practice, and then they are incorporated into the standard protocol, and going forward they become regulations also. Having said that, NABH always stands for patient safety, or when I say patient, it's of course the donor is also a patient, so that's also a very essential criteria, right? So we look for safety of all concerned, whether it's the staff, whether it is the facility handling the transplant. So it's a complete ecosystem which is ensured by the focus tools or the framework which NABH propagates. So to answer your question, there are obvious gaps in the current system. But going forward, I'm very optimistic that with the inputs from all specialized concerned, it is going to be an integral part of the way we deliver healthcare services in this domain. So thank you so much. We look forward to some very specific checklists, So with our reach and your expertise combined, if you propose to NABH certain rules to live by, certain guidance to which is authentic, validated, right, and which can be easily disseminated, I think all of us must come together to first do the capacity building, raise the awareness, because ILDA as it is in our country, which is as big and diverse as it is, where I mean, even hand hygiene may be a challenge in certain parts of the country, right? To create awareness is a big challenge, and authentic awareness on top of it can only flow in if organizations club their might. I hope I
And thank
addressed
you so much
very
for being open
abstractly
to.
some of the questions.
I have a
But
point
anyway,
on
it will not
mandating.
hesitate.
I have a point on mandating things. And as it is, there's just a lot of paperwork. And I went through a lot of it because we had to first sign all the paperwork. And there's just an infinite amount of paperwork. And a lot of people need to give no objection certificates. It's just, so my opinion is mandating more and more things is really probably not the way to go, because if you genuinely were forcing someone to do it, you'll find a way to get it done, because you'll simply do the paperwork and make sure it happens. I think the better area of focus is probably the potential donor, which is educating her. I'm going to say her because it's largely women. Educating her and giving her a ecosystem where she gets supported physically and psychologically to get to the point of saying, yeah, okay, I think I'm brave enough to go through this.
But how do you ensure that happens within the hospital setup, which is so geared to make a transplant happen?
And I'm kite flying here because I don't know the medical system as well, but I would create a living donor support sort of site, and all the people from all the hospitals or all the donors within all the hospital systems can access. I'm kite flying. So just a thought.
Dr.
Because
Kaur?
hospitals have their pressures. They are, at the end of the day, profit-making entities. And we all know about profit-making entities. They have their own sort of targets. And we need to support the people without disrupting really what is happening in a positive sense for patients, for recipients. I'll stop.
Dr. Kaur? You have to unmute yourself now.
Yeah. So I want to, add up to what Sudha said. Yes, there is a lot of paperwork. So I would say we need to put our process flow straight rather than more checklists in place, which is that before you evaluate a donor, you understand the person who's a potential donor. You establish a connect, you talk to them, as Sudha said. Let's have an education and awareness session. Let there be, let them sit at a comforting place, go through a video on what this organ donation is about, how it is going to change your life, what is going to happen to you, and then, do a psychological counseling and all of that. It can be a part of a process before you initiate a first discussion, which is way easier to follow if you have it in place, then ticking a checkbox that I have done my donor counseling. Ticking a checkbox is very objective. You've just ticked it and you said you've done it. But what we're looking at is the subjectivity with which this aspect is handled. So, our process and the way we handle our education and awareness, giving them an opportunity to ask questions, some videos, some links where you can, some frequently asked questions, some reading material, which will give them the confidence to speak up of what is their worrying. And one more thing that we have in our system is we have a very robust mental health and behavioral sciences program. So for just as we have a helpline for the caregiver, we can also have a donor support helpline where a potential donor should be able to pick up the phone, talk any 24 hours, the way we have tele-manners for, mental health, maybe some that kind of a helpline where, you have somebody who's there to listen to you, to answer something that's bothering you, allay all your apprehensions. That is what is going to make the process robust. So that's what I wanted to add. Yeah.
So I think at this point, I think we'd like to open up questions from the audience. There is a question already there. Siju, somebody wants to ask you, is it legal to make an excuse to donor's family in order to save her to undergo? Now, you shared that one of the wife didn't want to give, and it was decided that the family would be told that she's not a suitable donor. The person wants to know, is that legal?
As we see even in Indian scenario, because the act is more support to the donor, not the patient. So based on that thing to be that taken into consideration, in Indian scenario, we are emotionally more connected. So this should not be a problem for the donor, for the good sake of the donor, that we taken into consideration. So
okay, anybody? Brendan, how do you handle such scenarios in the US?
Yeah, and this is, we should have started with this. This should have been my example. And I'm so glad for Sudha putting her case in the, because often it's like, look, I love my family. I love the person, but I don't want to do this. But, and look, it may not necessarily even, Sudha, I'm not saying this was your case, but so often they'll say, but I just, I don't feel comfortable with my family knowing I don't want to do this. And there's so many different versions of that. So how do you handle the integrity and honesty of the institution while also the loyalty to the donor? So the question is, can you just outright lie? And I believe that most often you should try to not just lie and tell a total non-truth, but at least in the context of US privacy law, it is very possible to say this person is not a donor for medical rule out reasons, and that's all that other people are entitled to know. Now I understand that this can make it complicated if the family says, well, why not give us more, tell us more. They could be telling the donor, the person who was ruled out, why can't you donate? And then then you might have to work with that person to come up with a way to explain it. Right? They might even say, I've had donors who have said, look, they said I'm not medically suitable and that's all I know. And that was enough. And then others whose family members are doctors say, give us a medical reason, right? And then we have to come up with and explain, well, look, every patient, no one is naturally a donor, right? Taking a kidney or a piece of liver out of a person's body is not sort of medically indicated for anybody. So that means that there are things that you can describe that complicate the picture. And it's not a lie to say this person has a family history of X, Y, and Z, or this person has an abnormal, anatomy of, the cardiovascular system, which makes it more complicated to donate. And so then you can leave it. That's not a lie. It might not have been a total rule out, but that's enough to provide at least some comfort and reason, right? So that this is kind of the strategy in some cases.
Aisha, you have a question, I think. Please unmute yourself, Aisha. Aisha, you've raised your hand. You need to unmute yourself if you have to ask your question.
Hi, sorry, I was struggling to unmute. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the very insightful lecture. So my question is, because we see this kind of cases in our facility, the spouse, especially the wife who is coming in to donate to her husband, like she's a housewife, she's not the breadwinner, and she tells you that this is the only option she has, because if he's not well, they're not going to be getting any earning. But she's also so afraid and she doesn't want to fully do it.
Yeah.
She's just on the fence. but as if she wants to hear that you don't have to from us or to support her. So we really don't know how we can support them. Most of them actually go for the donation at the end with their willingness, but this comments from the patient themselves, the donor themselves, is just worrying. Thank you.
It's hard. Do you mind if it's really challenging, right? Because it's not as clear as you shouldn't, right? The heart can be very conflicted. And so saying, I'm here for you, let's talk this out, right? You don't have to do this, but maybe you want to, right? So let's figure it out. It's the same sort of shared decision-making process that happens in other contexts of medicine to say, okay, what are your values? What's most important to you? How do we recognize sort of the right manifestation of what you need in your life, right? And you work it out together. But just, for example, having someone there who is independent enough, saying, I'm here for you and only you, and you don't have to do this if you don't want to, oftentimes that's enough to help the person realize, yeah, maybe I do want to do this, right? Or, okay, you know what? Let's explore the fact that, let's say I don't. What would that look like, right? And that gets to this long chat over here that we're having with Sanjay and Supran about how you make it possible to say no, right? And it is a multi-step process. You don't figure it out in one instant, right? You take time, you meet repeatedly, you work it out with the team, and you come back. Make sure that the donor knows they don't have to decide right in this moment. Keep coming back to them and provide consistent and deep and focused support.
Thank you so much.
So I have a question back for Tripti. Tripti, so after a hospital received JCIA accreditation, and you feel that this whole role is not being implemented in its right spirit, does the JCI take any corrective actions? Is there any? You said we are not. It's not a prescriptive organization, but you mandated that, you have put that as one of the requirements for accreditation. How do you then handle if you see that it is, I mean,
I get your question. It's $1 million question. Like once the JCI happens, then we work and then accreditation goes and we forget about the standards. Like this is the usual way of doing that. But yes, again, I would put this viewpoint that institution or the governing body and the leadership are the one who should govern this particular thing. Ensure that sustainability is there. So there are multiple ways to ensure that sustainability. So we can, I think, we were talking about having a lot of documentation. I think Sudha ma'am was talking about that lot of documentation we need to do. Yes, that documentation gives us an opportunity to see whether this living donor advocacy program have gone through right for the person, right? So the documentation needed to be very, very thorough, and every interaction with the living donor needed to be documented. So documentation review is one of the way to know that whether it has, it's happening the way we intend to. And the second one is that, like, third party audit. The institution can define some criteria, not from the transplant team per se, like taking the objective criteria should be taken from outside and doing the audit and ensuring that whether this is in place or not. Another way of other, some of the institutions do ensure that sustainability, that govern, making some committee or the governing body which is from the outside, probably having advocate or some ethicist on board, or having some some external agency on board, where we evaluate each and every file to ensure that everything has taken place, the way the JCI standards has mandated. But fourth, I would say that nobody can be a better person than the donor himself or herself to talk about how this experience has been. So take the feedback from the donor, which we say that patient-reported experience measures, which is in the other way that NIH talks about PREM. So take that experience measure, understand that where we need to improve upon. So that will be a very good way of ensuring that where are we sustaining, and are we where we have gap, and how to bridge that gap.
Thank you so much, Tripti.
Pallavi, a donor support group is the most obvious thing, because if you have a transplant program, you have a lot of donors.
Yeah.
But somehow nobody has gotten around to saying, oh, you're thinking of it, go talk to this bunch of people. They meet every month.
We'll get thinking around it now that this we have a patient support group. Jaya leads that patient support group, and if that aspect can be brought in.
Yeah.
And parallel to that, we often have, for someone who comes in who's concerned, we say, hey, would you like to talk to somebody who's done this before, right? And we have a cadre, a group of people with a range of experiences. So they're not just hearing, oh, it was amazing, right? They have one person who says, oh, it was great. I was ready to get back to work the next day. We have another person who said, yeah, it took me like 2 weeks to recover. And I'll tell you, those 2 weeks were brutal. But by the end of those 2 weeks, I was really glad I did. So like to get a range of sort of experiences, and that the individuals have similar sort of backgrounds as the potential donor. That's important too, right? Like, who are you? What is your socioeconomic demographic? What's your relationship with the recipient? So they can connect on those dynamics too.
I'd like to go back to this question by comment by Dr. Nagral in the chat, and I would like Dr. Kaur to respond to it, where he's written, no hospital employee can really be autonomous. Siju, of course, is a transplant coordinator. You have a more overarching role. How do you want to respond to that comment, Dr. Kaur? You there? Yeah, Dr. Kaur? Unmute yourself. Brendan, would you like to respond to this?
I already tried. Yeah, truly autonomous. No one is, right? We're all subject to influences all the time, and the question is, how strong are those influences, and can they really, conflict you out? And I think there's no universal truth here. I think the job is to be as independent as possible, and to give the person you're advocating for the power to think about your relationship in a critical way and decide whether they feel comfortable with you.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
I think it's an evolving process. It's just that we have to begin to start thinking on these lines. Sudha came up with some very practical suggestions. Whether it should be mandated by the law or not is, again, I think you mentioned pretty early on, I was having sound problems. US, it's a federal requirement, right?
Yeah, in US, yeah.
Does that help?
I think the same with UK as well. It's a mandatory requirement.
Yeah. Any other questions that we have left out? Anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question? If not, any comments from the panelists? Any last comments from the panelists?
Yeah, so Palvi, I will just quickly, probably a very small comment, that at the end of the day, it's all about looking at the problem holistically. We probably would do better not to look at only the donor side. We have to as someone pointed out in the chat also, you have to look and address the issues related to not only education, awareness, but cadaveric. At the end of the day, solution has to be found, You have to have a donor, you have to have a recipient. And as we are a country as big and diverse as we are, probably you need something indigenized solutions. We have a very robust family system here, so it's not very easy to, give an analogy of USA or UK. We have different thought processes. We have different stigmas associated. We have different. We are different. We are Maggie. So we have to have our solutions also have to be thought of. Yeah, our own solutions. But you are very right. Creating education, creating awareness, and I agree that more mandate is sometimes not very good. It has to be a voluntary process, enabling process, so that all of us think on the same line. And at the end of the day, you have to find out a solution to be very, very neutral in what you convey to the donor, and let them take a call. We have to be facilitators in the entire process, and that can only come with time, right?
Sure.
Just to...
Completely agree with you there. Yeah.
I think Parul has a question. One last question. Parul, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, good evening, everyone. I actually wanted to ask everyone over here because we majority are Indians as the contributors in this meeting, and I would actually like to know more. And I would actually like to ask everyone over here that we also need to have some rectification in the laws as a when my own family was undergoing the liver transplant procedure of this around 2 years ago, the thing that I had a discussion with one of my German friends, they told me that one needs to undergo 6 months sobriety period. And it was a mandate thing over there. So unless and until they are completing that sober period, one cannot undergo a liver transplant because it is taking one whole life. One is going to donate their liver. It means a lot, right? So one needs to undergo some sort of restrictive period so that it is also ensuring that there is long-term benefits and it is going to help him, and also the sacrifice of the donor does not go waste at all. So I also wanted to ask on this, if someone could put in their input regarding this. Thanks.
I'm slightly unclear about the question, I think.
So,
But yeah.
Okay, Brendan. Yeah.
Well, if it has to do with the question about requiring sobriety before being eligible for a transplant, this is something that institutions have struggled with for a long time, because the question is, if you receive the transplant, are you just going to continue damaging that organ by virtue of the disease, the addiction, and the US has moved in certain direction, which is, okay, we want a period of sobriety to know that you will be a good steward of this precious resource, but we're going to give you support. We're not just going to say, okay, get sober. We're going to say, okay, here's access to rehab, here's access to social work support, etc. So to enable you to demonstrate the sobriety. And there is a fair bit of data that says individuals who have had a history of alcohol use disorder, when they get a liver transplant, do well with that transplant afterward, as long as they have some amount of support. Now, there are some cases where the condition is too acute, the person goes into an immediate liver failure, they haven't been able to demonstrate that sobriety. If there's an organ available for that person, they could get transplanted, right? So there is some flexibility in the criteria, but we're evolving on this.
Where Parul is coming from is that if a woman is expected to donate to a husband, an alcoholic husband especially, can there be systems in place to ensure that the whole...
Actually, I would like to add on to this, because I obviously would not like to mention the names due to anonymity. We have to respect that and their identity as well. I have actually had words with a daughter, and she is now 22 years old. When she was 18-year-old, she donated a part of her liver to her own father. Okay. And what happened was, immediately after like 3 or 4 months, he started doing what he used to do. So it was a complete waste of her sacrifice, of what she had undergone. So that is what I wanted to know. And I really wanted to ask everyone over here, so please raise something or some amendment of law or anything like that, that does not let the donors put at a stake of not only social, mental, and physical turmoil that they had to undergo during this whole procedure. So
understood.
Yeah.
I think
All right. So yeah, we will conclude. Just last few sentences from me. Especially in India, given the skewed ratio that we look at, the gender imbalance that we look at, and also given that we are a patriarchal society where we have wives, mothers, sisters who are the predominant donors. Therefore, it's perhaps time to look at how do we make this donor care process more robust? How do we safeguard their rights, and therefore how do we look at this ILDA role? Thank you so much, Brendan. This has been an excellent, very insightful discussions, knowing how things work out over there, and Sudha with her, the way she just shares her experiences, and very, very on the dot. Thank you so much, Sudha, for your time. I also wish to thank Dr. Kaur for taking us through the entire process. Shiju, for sharing your resources in your hospital. Dr. Kochar, Tripti, this was been very insightful. Thank you so much. Pallavi, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, everybody. It was really nice. I think, like I said, it's an evolving process. We have to learn from other countries, and as Dr. Kochar says, contextualize it within our issues, and but something that needs to be looked at going forward. Definitely not something. And as Sudha says, we have to find resources for our patients. Create resources that are available to them. Places they can go and find answers. Helplines that can give answers. So all of that, and I think also a requirement for training for ILDAs. Because I don't think we have any such thing. So if you are insisting that hospitals should have ILDAs, then there have to be some training opportunities available for them. So yeah, we are going to keep reaching out to you as we move forward to create these resources. Brendan, Tripti, Dr. Kaur, Sudha, we will take your input. Siju, Dr. Kochar, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for taking out your time. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.